Forest Rangers, what are your unexplainable and downright creepy stories? In 2016, my boyfriend, now my husband, and I went camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we decided to stop for the night was primitive. Camping was free, there was no cell service, barely a road, etc. We did encounter two other people. They might not factor into what happened later at all, but they were creepy, so I'll describe them. The first was a woman who had her truck off to the side of the road a little as we drove past. She had the hood open and seemed to be waiting for someone to stop and offer to help. Usually my boyfriend had no problem helping someone, but he said something about her that put him off. She didn't really seem like she needed help, and usually people who need help look at you, hopefully as you approach. She looked like she just expected us to stop. That's what my boyfriend said anyway. I hadn't really noticed anything that strange about her. The next person came when we had chosen a spot and were setting up a fire for hot dogs. I had noticed people drive by a few times, but my boyfriend pointed out that each time it was the same car and the man in the car watched us each time he passed. My boyfriend was a little uneasy about this, but we had driven around for a while before finding a place we liked. It'd been raining and everything was muddy and we wanted the driest site possible. How could he have been doing the same thing? Well, he could have been doing the same thing. We briefly thought about moving, but the road was muddy too. If he wanted to find us, all he had to do was follow the tracks. There were some other tracks, but not many. He'd only have to backtrack a little to locate us again. He didn't come by another time, so we stayed and spent the several remaining hours before dark goofing off. No one else drove by. Whether or not those two had anything else to do with our experience, the real fear came later. We had gone to sleep in our tent, and sometime around 3 a.m. we were awoken by this very loud noise. I can't describe it very well or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my boyfriend said it reminded him of a chain gun revving up. It was also similar to how it would sound if someone recorded a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it over a loudspeaker, which is another way he described it. He jumped up and looked out the little window, but he couldn't really see anything. The sound repeated itself a few more times. I was too scared to speak, so my boyfriend whispered that it was probably miles off and I should go back to sleep. I didn't question this, as I figured loud sounds could easily be heard miles away. After we left, he told me it sounded like it had actually been coming from just down the road, but he didn't want to freak me out. Looking back, I probably should have wondered why he would bother to whisper if, apparently, the sound was far off. I was still terrified, though. Every little thing I heard outside sounded like someone was walking around the tent. We laid there for a while longer when, finally, my boyfriend told me to get dressed because we were leaving. I got alarmed by this, and even more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete we had bought just for this trip from its plastic before opening the tent. We quickly packed up and loaded the car. I looked around for footprints that weren't our own, but despite the moon providing plenty of light, I couldn't really see them. I did point out something my boyfriend hadn't noticed before we got into the car. There was a beer can by our dead fire that hadn't been there before. We didn't even bring beer. While we were driving away, my boyfriend explained that he was nervous that someone might have been trying to lure us out, so he didn't think it was a good idea to run from the tent right away. He also half expected to find out the gas tank had been siphoned out, but that wouldn't have stopped us because we had a hybrid car. We joked that that would make a funny hybrid commercial. Number of brutal slayings avoided by driving a hybrid? 2. We only joked because we were about to crap ourselves out of fear and adrenaline even then. And for the rest of our trip, we only stayed at well-populated campsites or got a hotel. Story 2. One of my best buds from college was a geologist major who ended up becoming a ranger in the southeast U.S. We haven't spoken in years, as is the case with age, but I remember about 8 to 9 years ago, he was telling me about an old married couple that he had recently helped out. He had seen them come to the park several days in a row and found out they were visiting from out west and they had gotten engaged there decades prior. They'd been searching for a spot where they'd taken pictures of where he popped the question but were having trouble. After looking at the pictures and figuring out roughly where they were trying to get to, he escorted them in his vehicle, then hiked with them to where he thought it would be. They found it, and he left them there and went back to his station at the entrance. He said he got a weird feeling once he got back, and he felt like he needed to wait to see them whenever they left. Well, once it came time to lock up at night, he still hadn't seen them leave, so he reported it, left his assistant to wait at the shack at the entrance, and went back to where he left them. He eventually found both of them lying down, spooning along the bank of the river. Neither were alive. He called the cops, went through the 9 yards, and went home. The police were able to disclose their identities to him, but weren't sure of anything else initially. Later, he learned that the wife was terminally ill with cancer and they had both ended themselves by ingesting some sort of chemical or pill combination medication. They just chose to do it where they had gotten engaged. My bud wasn't torn up about it. He was obviously sad about them passing away, but said that he thought they hadn't asked for help earlier because, well, they didn't want anyone to think they helped end them. I guess this is what they mean when they say love and loyalty goes hand in hand. Now, if you think the husband's loyalty is top-notch, wait till you hear about the dog in story number 4. Story 3. I have a friend who's a trail ranger, basically a ranger who can't get you in trouble. He told me about this time he was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras and knocking down hunting stands, feeders, and blinds with another actual ranger. The other ranger wasn't feeling so well, so he said he was going to head back as it's a 1-hour ATV ride. My friend finished up the last one when he started hearing voices. Now keep in mind that he's far off the beaten path. He called out and no one replied. As it was getting dark, he started to head back and found that his ATV wouldn't start. He then noticed that the battery was not connected anymore. He reconnected it and started to drive, but it wasn't going fast at all. Less than a half a mile later, the whole thing died. He radioed back, basically saying, hey guys, I need someone to come pick me up. They told him they would, but it would be an hour. He asked if the other guy got back, and they said no. He settled down and started a small fire, but before long, he heard voices again. It's dark, and he's not happy now. The voices sound like arguments. Someone was angry and yelling at someone else who sounded more scared. He called out and asked if anyone needed help. The voices didn't seem to care. He guessed they had to be less than 1,000 feet away. He radioed again and they said they were having trouble finding what path he might be on and hadn't left yet. He asked them just to get the other ranger to tell them about where they were because he left with the iPad, which had the map. They said he still isn't back. About 3 more minutes go by and he hears the voices start up again. He decides to walk to them, hoping maybe they can stop being drunk a-holes and maybe have a map. He walked in their direction, but the voices seemed to be getting farther as he got closer. Finally, after 20 minutes, he gave up and walked back. He got a radio call and said the other guy was found passed out, covered in vomit, and was being taken to the hospital, but he crossed off everywhere. They found a stand, so they have a general idea of where he is. Then the radio ran out, and then the voices came back. Bored out of his mind, he decided to listen what they were arguing about, like, well, it wasn't yours to take. I don't care. You knew better. So on. His guess was that 2 hunters were arguing over a kill. Then he heard the one shout something intelligible, then silence. Bang, a gunshot. He doused his fire and hid. After that, he heard nothing. Just his breathing for the next half hour until he saw ATV lights. He told the guy picking him up everything and they called back. They had people looking for 3 hours and found nothing. They came back the next day with police and dogs. After about an hour, a shallow grave was found and in it was a long dead man who had clearly been. The thing was, it was a skeleton that had been there for years. So either the argument he heard just ended with a bang and both parties went home last night, or he heard the slaying of someone, but from years ago. Story 4. I have so many of these, but I'll share my favorite. I have been a ranger in the USFS for almost 15 years, but this took place about 3 years after I joined. We were getting calls about a lone wolf with a collar hanging around campsites. Weird, since wolves aren't known to be in the area, but when you work in the field long enough, you start to realize anything is possible. No calls had mentioned violent behavior from the animal, thank God. I departed from the station around noon to check out the places where it had been sighted. I wandered around for about 3 hours, no further calls during that time until I took a break for water. I sat down, had a snack, drank some water, and was getting ready to go again when the thing was about 20 feet out, trotting near the tree line. It seemed friendly and had a collar, so I whistled at it and he came over to me. Getting a closer look, I could see it wasn't a wolf. It was huge, but it was dark and didn't have the right body structure, though I could see why it'd be confusing from a distance. I radioed in and reported that I had the dog with me, but as soon as I said I'd bring it in, the dog took off. Like he was playing to see how far he could get me to chase him, typical dog behavior. I went after it, and I swear it was a game of chase for at least 5 minutes as we steadily ran through the forest. Please don't go running through woods unless you know the area like the back of your hand. The dog finally slowed down near a rock bed or a creek area and started pacing around a spot. I drew in closer and didn't see anything off at first, then I noticed it. The overgrowth had almost disguised what appeared to be bones. I called it in immediately and another team was sent to recover the remains. When I went to retrieve the dog, he was just gone. But honestly, it wasn't a priority at that point. He was friendly enough and I figured we'd catch up with him later. The bones were identified as those of a teenage male who passed away from a self-inflicted wound to the head. He'd been reported missing in the area long before I became a ranger, and there had been pretty much no hope of finding him. I spoke to his mom on the phone. She called to thank me personally, and she asked how I'd found her son. I mentioned the black dog, then thought I'd said something wrong since there was a pause on her side of the line. After I gave a couple of details about the dog, she quietly explained that her son, who struggled with making connections, had sunken into a deep depression after the death of his best friend, the very dog that led me to him. I think I spent the rest of the day stunned. I continue still to be in disbelief in a way, but I know what happened. Story 5. I'm not a ranger, but I lived on the outskirts of a national park in a cabin. It was a 4-mile drive from the main road just to get to the property, and we had no plumbing or power. This property was right next to where the park started. To call it the middle of nowhere is an understatement. My roommate at the time was interning with the park service, but he is a city kid. So every evening at the dead of night, I'd been hearing noises in the woods, what I thought was someone walking, but then they just stop in particularly overgrown areas of the jungle, so your mind starts to doubt itself. Is it a pig? A cat? Is it just the wind? The cabin didn't have a locking door and the owners didn't want me to install one, so I began sleeping in my car. Now this is a huge property and I'd parked my car over an acre away from the cabin and where I was hearing something. And I started hearing those footsteps again. I moved out and my roommate, who thought I was bonkers, stayed and still slept there without a locking door. He got robbed, not once, but twice after I moved out, so he finally put up motion-triggered cameras. There was a man with a long rifle who'd hike up to the property, set up in the bushes, and watch us. I would have probably installed locks on the doors the first time I got robbed. Story 6. I'm not a ranger, but I used to be in a group that's somewhat like the Scouts, so we spent a lot of time in the woods and some weird things happened often, but most of the time they were easy enough to explain. One thing did happen, though, that to this day scares me. I was the leader for the young age group and we were out on a camping trip. It was the first year we stayed on that terrain and it was huge. Normally, we tend to explore the majority of the terrain before the kids arrive, so we are aware of any possible dangerous spots to avoid. This time, it was impossible. At every camp, we have what we call a night game. It's usually a scary game in which the kids have to complete several tasks while the leaders scare the ever-loving crap out of them. Obviously, we had one, too, during that camp. We masked up as monsters and hid out in the woods close to the checkpoints they had to pass. While running in between checkpoints, I found an open stretch of forest with little to no foliage, so it was ideal for chasing after them. There was no real room to hide besides behind trees, so I couldn't use my flashlight or they'd be able to see me from miles away. It was dark, like the unsettling kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes and makes you start imagining things that aren't really there. So during my stay there, I saw a shadow that was around my size running past me a few times. I couldn't see it very well, so I just assumed I was imagining things because nothing was there when I turned my flashlight on. The game was nearing its end and I saw the shadow again. This time I could see it was vaguely standing near a tree not too far away from me. I thought it was one of the other leaders hiding to scare kids, and I decided to go over there and join him as it was about time to go back. I aimed my flashlight towards the tree, and while getting closer, I noticed that there was indeed someone standing there, dressed in what looked like a torn burlap sack and had their head covered with a few white plastic bags that looked like they were tied together. I started to feel pure dread. Something felt really off. I asked if everything was okay, but they didn't respond. The only thing I heard was this weird sound that sounded like someone knocking on wood. Nevertheless, I went a bit closer until I was about 10 meters away from this person. The knocking sound turned out to be that person smacking his head repeatedly into the tree, and I noticed he looked like a male. He was barefoot and his arms and legs were covered with crusted mud. His hands were in a weird cramp position. I was convinced this was just one of the other leaders pulling a prank, so I told them to knock it off. He slowly turned his head and started walking towards me. Something inside of me just told me to run. It didn't matter if it was just a stupid prank, and I ran away scared for nothing. If this wasn't a prank, it felt like I was in serious danger, so I ran as fast as I could. I heard him running after me, but I didn't want to turn around to look as I'd probably run into a tree. And I arrived back at the campsite and every single person that could be dressed like that was already there. They couldn't have gotten there before me, and if they did, they sure as hell didn't have the time to change into their regular clothes. Still, I told them that they gave me a good scare with that. They just looked back at me, weirdly, thinking I was trying to scare them, and we left it at that. So the next day, I wanted to go check it out. Who knows, maybe some weirdo ate the wrong mushroom and might be out there dying from hypothermia. I took someone else with me just in case, and there were nothing but endless trees. We arrived at the tree where I saw the person banging his head, and there was a dead, skin decomposing rabbit nailed to the tree. We called the cops, they looked around quickly and brushed it off as just a prank from another scouting group or some kids from the nearby town and left it at that. We didn't notice anything weird after that, so it probably was a dumb prank, but seriously, some people have a messed up sense of humor. Story 7. I'm not a ranger, but I was camping out with my dog one night along the Mogollon Rim of Arizona. It was dark and we were sitting around the campfire when we heard something behind a bush close to our camp. Instead of my dog barking at it, he began to whimper. I didn't think anything of it and just tended to the fire. After a couple of minutes, we heard some more noises from a different bush. This time, my dog gets up, goes over to the tent, and scratches the door because he wants to go in. I toss a couple of rocks in the direction I heard the noise and nothing happens. I'm spooked now, so I toss a couple of pieces of wood on the fire and climb into my tent with my dog, hoping that the light from the fire would keep whatever was out there away. We eventually fell asleep and luckily had no other disturbances during the night. The next morning, I went out behind the bushes where we had heard the noises and found mountain lion tracks that were circling around our camp. I'm sure glad I didn't go looking at night when I heard the noises. Holy crap, this dude has to thank his dog for this one. He was watching out for both of them. Story 8. I was not a ranger, but my uncle was. He always told me the story of how, when he worked in Montana, he was a solid 5 to 10 miles away from town, so pretty much deep into the woods. He recalled pulling his ATV on top of a semi-big hill that overlooked a valley. In between all the trees, there was this clearing he could see through his binoculars, and through them, he saw an older lady, around 60-plus-ish, in black, surrounded by 6 to 8 wolves. Now, he is a lengthy distance from the woman, but he starts yelling and honking and all that and takes off down the hill as fast as he can. But when he reaches the clearing, there's no one there. No wolves, no woman, only a silver ring with a black stone in the middle. He still has it to this day. Story 9. I'm a ranger, non-peace officer, and work at a pretty remote desert park. Now, this happened before I got there, but the other rangers I work with were there. They went to do a patrol during the summer, our off-season, at one of our seldom-used campgrounds. On a patrol, our maintenance ranger found a burnt-out car at one of the sites. The desert is a weird place, so he just calls the sheriff and waits. The sheriff arrives, and it turns out there's a body in the driver's seat, just a torso and head. Sheriff just marked it as self-harm and removed the vehicle. We are close to Mexico and get a lot of illegal traffic, so I guess they don't even bother trying to solve those. Super sketchy. Story 10. Not a ranger, but here's a good woodland story. It's late spring, heavy rain has flooded the dike and public hunting grounds, so I get the idea to go fishing in the shallows with my buddy. We had a good time, didn't catch anything, and it's getting dark, so we lit up a fire to dry off before heading back. As the sunlight was swallowed up, we heard something I can only describe as a blood-curdling scream coming from the distance. A little girl, almost. Frogs, we thought, kept talking, twig snapping, then again, but much closer, we heard it. Could have been as close as 30 feet at the tree line. So we hightail it out of there and laugh it off once we get home. Fast forward 6 years, I'm on lunch break and I'm telling this story to my lead and he pulls up a video on YouTube and lets me listen. The same scream. He gives me the phone and I see a mountain lion. They make that noise as a final warning. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you're also going to enjoy people who work at remote places. What creepy things have you noticed? Story 4 is just so crazy scary. I'll see you in that video, and thanks for watching.